Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of August 16th, 2020. Today, we are going to have a fascinating conversation about transhumanist art and activism and how to promote a more techno-optimistic and hopeful vision for the general public. So with us today, we have a selection of our US Transhumanist Party officers, including our 2020 US presidential candidate and Director of Marketing, Charlie Kam, our Director of Applied Innovation, David Shoemaker, our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, and also our Director of Scholarship, Dan Elton. And as our special guest for today, we have Thomas James O'Carroll from the United Kingdom. He is a transhumanist activist. He has been involved extensively working with Transhumanist UK, our counterparts in the United Kingdom, and he has some very promising and interesting initiatives to discuss with us today. So Thomas, welcome. And I would ask you to begin by telling our audience who might not yet be familiar with this organization, what is Transhumanist UK? What is some of the background for this organization? And as I understand, there is a bit of a rebranding and outreach initiative going on with that organization right now. So if you could tell us about that, that would be excellent as well.
Of course. So hello, everyone. I'm Thomas Carroll. I've been involved since about 2015, on and off. And as Gennady said, I am a transhumanist activist. So that means that I annoy people on Facebook a lot of the time. It's mainly me just trying to make sure that the humanist aspects of what we do is still in the conversation and it's not forgotten. So Transhumanist UK has been going for quite a while. It started around the same time as the US Transhumanist Party did. I believe originally it was called the Techno-Progressive Party. And it's been going for a bit of a rebrand recently. So the website's being completely updated. We're changing, chopping and changing a couple of bits and bobs here and there, and just trying to get it so that people are more engaged. We've hit a bit of a stalemate with the membership. It's been rising, but not as much as we would have hoped. So it's about trying to get that engagement going and get people interested again.
Great. Well, art is one of the major thrusts of this initiative to gain greater public engagement for Transhumanist UK. And along these lines, could you discuss some of the projects that you've been involved with to get this new transhumanist art created?
Mm-hmm. So currently I am been in a conversation with a young artist called Ed Byrne. Ed Byrne is an artist who uses both animation, digital work and hand drawing to try and portray his artwork. He does have a website, which is, let me just get that up. I believe it is edwardburn.com. So that's EDWOODBURN.com.
Yes, and I posted a link to the website in the chat as well for those who are interested.
Mm-hmm. So he mixes a mix of animation, a mix of digital artwork and of hand drawing. And it really creates a unique perspective. And what we've asked him to do is I've gave him a budget of around £600 out of my own personal funds to try and create a web image for our website. The brief that we gave him was that it had to try and portray certain imagery within that to try and get the transhumanist thing. It was based on the prologue and the promise. We've asked for specific colors to be initiated into that. to try and help build the psychological draw to the image. And the image is also possible to break down into smaller sections for the website itself.
Yes, indeed. And for those of us who are familiar with the work of Robert McCall, the prologue and the promise is one of his most famous and largest scale paintings, essentially depicting the evolution of human achievement all the way from the pyramids of Egypt and the Parthenon of Athens to this new space age civilization that Robert McCall envisioned. Now, McCall did much of his painting during the late 20th century in the 1970s through the early 1990s, though he died in 2010, if I recall correctly. But he created some of the most hopeful, techno-optimistic visions of any artist up to our time. So I'm very pleased that McCall's work was an inspiration for this. And I also posted a link to the image for the prologue and the promise in the chat. So those of you who are interested in that painting, I urge you to take a look. Now, Thomas, I understand you essentially just a few hours ago got the concept that Mr. Byrne provided. So if you could share that with us, that would be great.
Of course, give me 2 seconds.
Yes, and let us give Thomas the host role.
Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes, indeed.
So this is the, I'll just try and, so this is the image here. Now, as you can see, we've tried to focus on specific areas within this image so that you have the more raw areas. You've got the people in the foreground looking forward towards the futuristic vision. We have a floating city in the background of the water. You've got new agricultural systems being used. It is quite small on the screen, so I do apologize for that. This is the initial concept for it. So we are looking for little tidbits to come our way from our audience, just so that we can get a bit more information on what you guys think of the image, so that we can incorporate those in. If I scroll down, you can see part of the initial design. So in this section, you can see where we've tried to include the sea-based city, agricultural and influence, exoskeletons and robots, diversity. We tried to the rural in city in there, and it's basically just so that this image can be used on the main site and then broken down across the rest of the site. Now, as I say, this is completely in the early stages. It is still going to be adapted and changed. It's just to try and get a few ideas from the community now and see what you guys think of this image.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for this introduction, Thomas. And for me, this is a fascinating concept because it combines so many of the technologies that transhumanists have been advocating, and it works them together into this scene to demonstrate the effects of their simultaneous deployment, how the world would look different, how society would look different, how people and other sentient entities would be able to thrive in that kind of world. And it would be a more harmonious, more inclusive, more tolerant world as well. Alexandria Black in the comments mentions solar punk. So solar punk is a genre of science fiction that is fairly recent that tries to be a counter to these dystopian visions and also tries to portray how technology can result in a more prosperous existence with more human well-being, also better environmental outcomes, more sustainable outcomes. And this vision definitely shows that. And what I like is the interactive aspect as well. We've mentioned it would be possible for people to hover over some of these elements of this scene and find out more about a particular technology and its trajectory of possible future development or societal outcomes, like you mentioned, diversity. So this is a great learning tool. I think sometimes when people just read an article about transhumanism or an article about one particular branch of emerging technologies, they might think, well, this might be great, but what about all of these other aspects, or what about all of these other problems in society? And sometimes people kind of pit these areas against one another. Like they say, oh, why should we pursue space travel when we have so many problems here on Earth? Or we should get to radical life extension first before we pursue space travel, or vice versa. And some people, they seem to have this kind of tunnel vision focus where they just think one particular thing has to happen first before anything else can happen. But this simultaneous vision of future advancement in a variety of areas can really show how all of these developments are complementary and they can build upon one another and reinforce one another. So
They are all
that,
cells in a larger organism at the end of it. So it's all something that's got to be working together to really get us going anywhere.
mhm. Yes, indeed. So now let's go to our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers. What thoughts, questions, observations do you have regarding this concept art? Dan Elton, do you have any thoughts to start us off? Dan, I believe you're on mute.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this looks a lot like the prologue and the promise in that it's kind of a sweeping landscape. But obviously, it's all at one fixed time, whereas that was, kind of cutting across time. I think maybe you should have some kind of advisor to try to make it as scientifically and technologically as accurate as possible. Because I'm sort of personally, I'm kind of like a big fan of hard sci-fi, and it kind of annoys me sometimes when there's things that are not physically possible, or you have there's some kind of some kind of gimme you have to swallow, or so yeah, like you might put a space elevator in, but try to make it realistic, in terms of the cable and different, the laser, the beam that might be powering it and stuff like that. That would be my main suggestion. I think I'm also just wondering what the overall vision is here in terms of where this might be displayed or how it might be used. I guess
So in answer to that, so when we did the brief, we actually did discuss how realistic we wanted the image. And one of the things that we said was trying to put in more cartoony little sections, because what happens is part of the human brain actually, when you're focusing on images, you're looking for things that stand out of place. So it's to draw the eye. So another part of the concept is that within this image, there will possibly be little moving elements, little animations. Ed is also a very good animator. So, for instance, one of the robots may just spin around every now and then randomly, or a comet may fly across the sky at some point. And this was to draw attention to the image, to get people looking into it. Every section of the image that's been created is, as I say, to focus on certain sections. So if we want to talk about on the website environmental, it will focus on the environmental section of the image. If you want to talk about rural, then you've got the rural section. Construction. So this is basically, this will be the main part of the website. When you go on the website, you'll see that at the top, and then smaller sections can be used across the website itself later on.
Interesting. I see. Great. Yeah. No, yes, I like the idea of making it somewhat interactive.
So we've tried what we're trying to do.
I mean, visually, it's very aesthetically, like well laid out. I tend to obsess about details, so I like.
I completely agree.
To be accurate. And,
I'm exactly the same as you. When I focus on a film, I look at those scientific little bits that are not quite accurate enough. That jargon that gets used in Star Trek, there's all these kind of things that sort of everyone gets a bit annoyed with. But as I say, it's the psychology that we're trying to implement into the image is to try and get people's attention on certain areas. Hence why we've got these cartoony bits in there to try and draw attention to that section. This is only, as I say, the initial design. This is literally Ed's quick sketches. I think this has come up within the space of a week and a half of Ed just every now and then having a little tinker with it. So this is not the finished image.
Yes, indeed. And we look forward to seeing how this image develops over time. Now, I'm reminded of another vision of the future that I had a hand in because I commissioned it back in 2017, and that is the city of New Anti-Death. Now, that would be an even farther off future. It would be a world where essentially mega structures on other terraformed planets would be possible. And the city of New Anti-Death represents a vision of a world that has essentially conquered some of the great perils of the human condition, including death itself. So I've included a link to this in the chat, but there is this other image, Thomas, that you were showing on page 4 of your slides. If you could discuss that one as well and what you have in mind for it. Thomas, I think you're on mute for whatever reason.
Sorry about that. So yeah, these images here are just general style guides. So they are, again, quick images that Ed has done whilst we were chatting to try and get an idea of what we wanted to do with the larger image at the end of it. So these are just some of Ed's ideas when he was putting this whole section together.
Yes, indeed. And I am quite fond of the styles of those images as well. Again, this combination of advanced technology with a very pleasant landscape, very aesthetically appealing light effects. The idea is you could go for a nice stroll in this landscape and enjoy the view, and what you see is uniformly prosperous and pleasing to the eye, and it's a sign that humankind has really advanced, has really gotten over some of the problems that our contemporary societies face. So I am quite fond of these visions that you've displayed. Any other comments from the U.S. Transhumanist Party officers?
Yeah, I think, you might, with the city, you know, some of these buildings, they look a little bit wonky, like, you know, you're trying to force some kind of you know, some kind of novelty, or something, you know, futuristic. But maybe what you could do is actually have something. You know, to me, these buildings, they look a little bit stereotypical in some respects. You know, a lot of times, you know, they're just sort of wonky architecture that is kind of in the futurist, maybe even brutalist tradition. But what you could do is actually maybe think about something more radical, which would be something more self-contained, like, because in the future, cities, they may be designed as a whole, you know, like a smart city designed for in advance and laid out with efficiency in mind, and optimal resource utilization and such. So it may not be such a chaotic conglomeration of buildings, or rather some kind of like, you know, like in SimCity. I don't know if you ever played SimCity 2000, but they have these things called archaeologies, which are like the most advanced buildings. And basically it was kind of like a all-in-one structure where you had farming and residential and business, like all in one thing. So you might think about how you could make it a little, you know, a little even more kind of radical, like, you know, not a dome, because a dome would imply like the habitat is not safe outside, but some kind of large structure. And then, or you know, a series of things which are laid out in a very aesthetically pleasing way.
So
or, you know, but this is just an idea. Or you could go sort of in the more narco-capitalist direction of just sort of, you know, buildings everywhere.
So in answer to that, so I'm actually based in construction industry. I've been involved with some extremely large projects, including one which was the size of the site was the size of central London. So when it comes to planning and building cities and things like that, I've got quite a large knowledge on that subject. The problem that you find with cities such as that is that budgeting comes into play, and things aren't designed specifically for the job that they're meant to have. So, for instance, you may get a shop which they build the shop and then they build flats around that, and those flats, the internal designs for things such as where the gas meter is, it's not designed for living. It's designed as if it was going to be a shop. There's all different aspects that you find with that kind of construction. Now, going back to the image that we have here, we've tried to, so what was said to Ed in the brief was to try and give it a British feel, which is why a lot of the buildings actually mimic buildings which are within London and which are built within London. So you may see there is an older structure kind of central left, which is based kind of on the pillars of St Paul's Cathedral. So Ed Burns, the artist, has taken aspects that we've gave him from the original UK sort of brief. So the green rolling hills of England. You've got the city on the left-hand side, the sort of floating city that's being built out there. That is from a couple of different websites that I sent him on transhumanist projects. So he's literally taken bits of information that I sent him. So I feel sorry for him, to be honest, for the research that I gave him. I just literally piled it on him. I even sent him to H Plus Media, so he had a lot to go through. But yeah, he's tried to base the image across the board and try to focus it on what he sees we're going at the moment.
Well,
I completely agree with you. I think cities are going to be a bit more based together in the future, but it all depends on.
I mean, it's most cities will probably continue to be built off the existing cities in the kind of in an organic way, but I think we may, as develop into new previously uninhabitable areas, and there we'll have sort of a blank slate, like they're doing in Dubai and other places, to build these more purposefully laid out type things. I'm not necessarily advocating for that. I'm just saying like that would be maybe more visually interesting or thought-provoking.
So I personally do advocate for that, because I feel that kind of city does work and it does help with, as I say, the humanistic aspect. But as I say, the problem that I found is with budgeting, what they usually do is they get in a contractor who is based on one type of construction. So they may be a constructor someone who works in construction who is solely based on shop building. Whereas there's lots of living quarters or car parks and things like that. So it doesn't get incorporated into the design as well. Also, for instance, my main focus is horticulture. So I build horticulture and environmental. So, for instance, I've built water vole habitats and things like that. And when I come to the design of those areas, I have to take in corporation the animals and things like that. And usually a designer will come in and go completely change it. And you'll end up with something that's not habitable to the water vole because that's not the habits of the water vole. You get a conflict between the actual design and the designer.
I guess what I was saying was more kind of more just integrated type structures, if that makes sense. The ones that look the most interesting are those ones sort of in the distance.
I will pass it on to him, and
I
see
like
if we can.
I like the idea of like removing the roads, because maybe we'll have some kind of underground transportation like Hyperloop or something like that.
It's interesting too, with regard to the building elements. London itself is quite an eclectic city architecturally. We have, of course, the historic buildings in London, St. Paul's Cathedral or Buckingham Palace, and then we have the newer structures, which are some of the most interesting in Europe, like the Shard or the 30 St. Mary Axe or the Lloyds of London towers, for example, and they all coexist. It's one of the most vibrant cities architecturally in Europe, and I can see how if you are seeking to kind of extrapolate that vision going forward, this would be the kind of place where a lot of interesting architectural experiments take place. Now, for the City of New Anti-Death vision that I had, I asked the artist, who is Yekaterina Valinakova, to essentially combine historical styles with more experimental futuristic styles, and have some buildings that are very traditional and some buildings that are highly experimental, or combine these elements into megastructures. So in that painting, there are buildings that have traditional European, such as French or English or Italian architectural elements. There are buildings that have Russian architectural elements or Persian or Indian ones. And then there are these futuristic skyscrapers that might work in a few of those elements here or there. Again, bringing in the concept of diversity, how these different architectural traditions are going to interact with one another and lead to new creations, amalgamations. I also gave the artist some concepts of buildings that I had developed on my own in programs like SketchUp or even in Minecraft, just experiments. Of course, I'm not an architect, so I'm not going to say that these are concepts that are going to work in the next 10 or 20 years, but I do think that the more remote one's vision is in terms of where it's situated in the future, the more liberties of this sort one can take, because according to Arthur C. Clarke's third law, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So if we have a future society which has overcome some of these limitations, really, I would say it may be possible to bring those visions into being, depending on the inclinations of the people who live in those societies. But it's a good idea to give them the vision for that, to give them an idea of, well, perhaps we could have this kind of future, a future that looks something like this. So, Charlie, what thoughts do you have on these concepts?
I think this is a magnificent photo. I really think this. I think you guys did a great job on this. It looks, it looks really compelling. It's fun to look at. I had a quick question. You said your partner's name, the guy you work with, his name is it Ed Byrne? Is that correct?
Edward Byrne, yeah.
Edward Byrne. But did you say his website is Ed Wood?
Ed Wood, yeah.
Is that an homage to the famous director Ed Wood from 1950s?
You'd have to ask him, I'm afraid.
Well, because
I know there is another artist called Ed Byrne, which is spelt differently, but yeah, I don't know if that's an homage.
Well, because I do films and stuff, so I'm kind of familiar. When as soon as I heard the spelling, when you started spelling it, I was expecting it to be Ed Byrne. When I heard Ed Wood, I thought, if he's into that kind of stuff, Ed Wood was a famous director, kind of infamous in a way. He was from the 50s. He did such low budget science fiction films. They were almost considered terrible, but they got he did so many that it became endearing. And they did a movie starring Johnny Depp about him. And one of his most famous low budget films was called Plan 9 from Outer Space, because he was really into that kind of stuff, which brings me to another question about this. How far in the future are these like this one? How far in the future was this supposed to be?
So this wasn't based on any time frame, as far as I'm aware. This was based on just trying to show where we could be in a few years' time. So if we're looking at the rate of change within buildings in London, London is a constantly developing city. There's constant building work going on, new buildings going up. So this could be anything from the next 30 years to the next 120 years of where we could be.
Because I like as Dan was saying, he's a stickler for detail, and I tend to ruin movies for myself and anybody sitting near me when I start pointing out, well, that can't be, because 10 years from now we're all going to be robots or something. So if we were, if we do merge with technology and over the next 10, 20, 30, let's say by 2045, and we're all basically cyborgs and robots, if we're made out of some sort of alloy, our bodies are, and we're impervious to certain environmental constraint or problems, buildings may become obsolete. So there's that. But you never know. I mean, who knows how things will actually play out. I was also curious because lately there's been a big drive to go to Mars, and I'm wondering, I suppose this is supposed to be on Earth, but you could throw a couple of moons up there and say it's Phoebus and what's the other one, Deimos, and just say like we're on Mars now. I don't know. I like it a lot. I think you guys did a great job, and I look forward to other artwork here today.
Thank you very much. I will again. I'll suggest that to him. The main focus of when we were trying to create this image was to promote the UK Transhumanist Party a bit more, and try and get that imagery to sort of work in a specific way so that it gave that UK feel to it, which is quite difficult to do considering, especially at this time of political discharge, is we don't know where England really stands anymore, especially with Brexit, where a 50-50 sort of divide on what is British. And yeah, so we wanted to try and bring it back a bit and say, you've got the green grass of home, you've got the city, which is adapted, and you've got technological advancement. Which is something that we've always had from Oxford and Cambridge universities. We've always tried to be at the height of scientific progress.
Yes, indeed. Now, there are some questions in the chat about the manner in which this concept was created. So Mike Lazine asks, was this image rendered with Prismacolor markers or pencils? And then he asks, what media were used? Were they traditional media or a program like Photoshop?
So this was Photoshop and SketchUp, I believe, were the two main things that he used to create this image. He uses a stylus pen to try and create that humanistic aspect to it. So he's getting the transhumanist feel in the way he's actually creating the image itself. So it's not just a digital image, it's not just a hand-drawn image, it is literally the merging of the two.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And I'm quite familiar with this technique of digital drawing and digital painting with a stylus. I even have one myself, even though I'm not an artist, but I have experimented with it from time to time. And it does indeed allow one to emulate the outcomes of drawing with traditional media. And I would say, I'll correct myself, I'm not a painter. I have created art of a different kind, digital art, fractal art. But certainly Mr. Byrne has a great deal of talent with these tools, and to the point where it can raise questions about what media he used, because this does look But now let us go to our painter among our USTP officers. Art Ramon, what are your thoughts on this concept and any questions or ideas that you might have?
I think you should move the sun over to the right, which would be kind of like eastward, and therefore it's a new dawn, versus being towards the left, which is west, is kind of a sunset. So symbolically, I think you should move the sun over to the east side, and then maybe darken up over towards where the spaceship is going, and maybe put a moon up there. So I think that would help a little bit.
I like the idea. So when we were, I do know when we were talking about the placement of the sun, we were also talking about how you draw focus to specific areas. And we did mention about how you add a splash of red or a splash of color to the left or the right hand corners to try and draw attention and create that sort of positivity that you're explaining. So I'm not sure if that was placed there for that reason, but I do like the idea of the new dawn. That does give it a bit more gravitas.
Yeah, it's wide enough that you can sort of separate kind of a daylight and a darkness. So, yeah,
So
I think
I will also say that 3 days ago, the image actually was only up to the car on the right hand side. That whole section has been added afterwards, after I was talking about adding in the green hills of England to sort of try and give it that more English feel with Ed himself. So originally, you can probably tell where some of it's a bit more fleshed out. The people on the right hand side weren't there, and that whole section of the image wasn't there. So this is a great opportunity for us to learn where we can place things on that side now, and adding the concept of moving the sun does
great.
add to that.
That's my suggestion, really. I know it's still a work in progress, but like I said, that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Yes, some great concrete pointers there from Art Ramon. And thank you also to Dan Elton for your participation and good insights and feedback into how perhaps to incorporate more hard scientific elements into a vision like this. I know that Dan has had to leave early, but we appreciate his comments. And now let us go to David Shoemaker. David, what are your thoughts regarding this concept and any questions or further ideas you might have?
Yes, I really want to say that I really like the idea of at least what I see in the photo, which is a very broad generalization of a transhumanist future that is perhaps not that far away. So if what I'm reading into that is correct, the elements that I like about it is if I was from the UK, I was from London, I think, and somebody was showing this to me and introducing me to transhumanism, I would want to find myself in this picture. And there are places where I can do that. Do I live in the countryside? Do I live in the city? Maybe some of the elements of the city itself are those things. Would they be things that I would identify with? As an American, I think of things like the Tower of Big Ben or something like that. But how do I relate to this? How do I feel attached to this? And then also attached to the interests that I have. So interests like space flight, the sea-based cities, those may be interests that really appeal to me, and maybe other parts not so much, but that's okay because it gives me a context of a very broad brush of what this transhumanist future is like. So I can perhaps relate to the parts that I find myself most attracted to, but not have it feel like they're stovepipes, that only those are the parts of the transhumanist future where I can see all of that. And as I talk to other people, they can relate to things that are different for themselves. So being in agreement with those who pick apart sci-fi movies or sci-fi novels when they come across things that are not accurate, I tend to look at this just a little different. I tend to look at this as more of the feeling of the future versus a photorealistic image of the future, which I don't think anyone can do, of course. But can I somehow be emotionally transported to this future, seeing the things that I'm most interested in the larger scope of perhaps a much wider picture. So Thomas, I think what we have here is a start to something that really, really does a good job of that. And if that's your purpose, to draw more people to transhumanism and allow them to relate to it, I think they're going to need to be able to relate to it emotionally. And I see the elements of that in this picture. So thanks so much for starting a project like this.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No problem at all. That was so it was David Wood who initially put up on the website that he was looking for a new image, and he was looking for images that weren't copyrighted. And it's where I initially put the suggestion of having a piece commissioned. So yeah, I put it forward, and I contacted Ed. There was a few artists that I had in mind that I'm very good friends with that I thought I'd contact, but I knew that Ed used that mixture of both digital and hand drawn. So it was him I contacted, and this is the start of a great image, I do believe. And we'll be taking all these suggestions to him. I will be taking them to David as well, seeing where we can go with it, and chop and change and see where we're at from there.
Yes, indeed. And of course, David Wood has been a long-standing presence in the transhumanist community, a great friend and ally of the US Transhumanist Party, one of our allied members, in fact. And I've participated in conversations with him on the London Futurists group, and also have met him in person at various RADFests. So I know that he is quite committed to bringing this techno-optimistic vision about and charting the course for humanity to get to it. And I am pleased but not surprised that this kind of art would be a part of this vision that he has in mind. So now let us go to some of the other questions and comments in the chat, where John Halloran mentions that progress usually follows a much, quote, messier path forward. Some will prioritize space travel, others life/health extension, others robotics and AGI. They tend to pollinate each other in unpredictable ways. And I do agree that people will have areas of interest, areas of focus that they devote much of their time and energy to. But the broader society, of course, is affected by all of these efforts and the interactions, the synergies among these efforts. So I still think that even if different people focus on different areas, some broader overall picture that looks like this could emerge from that. Now, going forward, Alexandria Black mentions some other initiatives that may have similar visions, like the Earth Organization for Sustainability and the Cube Spawn Project and the Venus Project. She asks if this is just a riff off of the Venus Project. I don't think so, because the Venus Project has a very specific economic model, a very specific structure behind it, like this idea of a city with this central core, a central headquarters almost, where everything radiates out from that in concentric circles, and people have resource allocations to them based on their specific needs as determined by the central coordinating mechanism. And I don't think this vision is that prescriptive. The vision here is more of a possible future that can arise out of a convergence of various technologies, but it doesn't presuppose necessarily a particular economic model or a particular set of policies. It's just one of the good outcomes in the future of humanity that we can get to if we make prudent decisions along the way. Now, Thomas, I'm wondering if you would agree with that characterization.
I personally do, yeah. So one of the things that I really liked about the images was on the left-hand side, you have the pipes, and it's showing it almost sucking up pollution, and then following it round, you can see it goes to this sort of agricultural section where you've got a couple of robots putting plants in there and actually being that bit more environmental. So he's adding his own the artist Ed has added his own ideas to that from the conceptual. This isn't a full reality sort of image. There's not much in there that is 100% going to be or it's going out. This is a conceptual image to sort of get our our minds thinking and our minds looking towards that sort of this progress.
Yes, indeed. And this was how I was thinking of this image when I was reacting to it as well. Now, Mike Lezine states that some of the coolest cities he has seen in sci-fi are in Blade Runner 2049 for LA, Earth in the Star Trek reboot universe, and also the recent Valerian movie. So I wonder who among you has familiarity with these visions, and if you'd like to compare and contrast any of them to the concept presented here.
So the only one I'm unsure of is the Valerian one. I've very much a fan of Star Trek. I absolutely love it. I love the fact that in the new Picard series, for instance, how you can see the mixture of green and architectural landscaping with the buildings, so it sort of merges into almost one sort of unit, and you can see that they're built for purpose. The Blade Runner one, I would say, is a bit more dystopian because it's often pictured with a bit more pollution within the system, or a bit more overpopulation, and I find that one a bit more of that dystopian sort of feel to it, which goes with the movie. But the imagery that was shown in it, such as like the giant hologram of the girl inside in the film, and the way the city actually like reacts with the people, that was something that I really like, and that's something that you can see at the moment as well. So, for instance, the Sainsbury's laboratory, which is in Oxford, the building actually adapts and changes to the environment around it. So the windows open up at certain speeds, and they'll black themselves out. The light will go change depending on the weather, just to try and get people more active and using the building in a way where they're emotionally a bit more better. And that's a fantastic building to check out. It does, as I say, it's the Sainsbury's Laboratory in Oxford, and that is linked with the botanical gardens of Oxford. It might be Cambridge, actually. I'm not sure. Actually, no, it's Cambridge. Sorry, I do apologise.
Yes, and if you have a link to an image of that laboratory, I'd be happy to share that with the audience as well. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I did share a link to an image of the Valerian city that Mike Lezine was mentioning. This is from the film Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets. So this is a different vision from the one that was presented here, in that it's not a terrestrial city at all. It's an outgrowth of a space station where there are essentially just vast buildings kind of emerging from each side of it. So it's a floating city in space that just keeps on growing and developing. So it can seem a bit chaotic, a bit haphazard, but also quite advanced technologically and quite vibrant. So I do think there are a lot of different visions of the future that are possible, depending on, of course, the environment in which a future city is situated, the kinds of technologies that one would consider to be most influential in one's vision of the future. But they all have the purpose of getting people to think a bit beyond the status quo, and to realize that just as the present is very different from the past, the future can be very different from the present. So Pavel Ilin has joined us in the chat. Welcome, Pavel. And he asks, what do you think about arcologies, cities where we can use 3 dimensions to arrange our living and working space. And I believe Dan Elton mentioned arcologies briefly in his own comments as well. But Thomas, I'm wondering if you've come across the concept.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Arcologies, ARCOLOGIES. So it's a possible future city concept. And what it is a portmanteau of architecture and ecology, a field of creating architectural design principles for very densely populated, ecologically low impact human habitats. There's a Wikipedia entry.
I am a huge fan
arcologies.
of ecological habitats, so of human habitation projects and things like that. So this is something that I would be very interested in looking into a bit more. I have seen, so for instance, I've been involved with buildings which have had green walls installed. And whilst we're adding those green walls, we've had the problem of, for instance, the water system failing and things like that. Halfway along, something gets stuck in there and it causes the whole wall to go. So things like this do need that bit more thought, and when it goes into the actual project itself being built, they need to really be considered on every aspect of what could go wrong and how it gets maintained. Because that's another aspect, is that when you have these places with green walls that go up, is how they are then maintained afterwards. Do you have a cherry picker which goes up every time, especially in a city like London where you can't park up next to the building, and how it's going to be taken to be maintained? You're going to have those problems, and you need to put those into the design itself when you're coming up with those kind of building projects.
And that is quite interesting to mention here, that there are some practical considerations, not just in creating those structures, but in maintaining them over time. And would you say that for a lot of futuristic visions, that is the obstacle at this time, figuring out sustainable maintenance, or is it more of a technical obstacle about how to construct the buildings?
It's a bit of both. So I'll put it this way. So when I've done, I did a project on bombarder beetles. So we thought this species of bombarder beetle was extinct in the UK, and they were found on a location in Kent. Now, what we did was, because this site was going to be developed, we decided we were going to move them from that area to another area. So what we did was we literally recreated the whole environment for the bombarder beetles and moved it to the other side of the river in a place it's in London, but it's on the border of Essex, called Barking. So we took it from, it was about 40 miles. We rebuilt this whole area. So it was chalk soil, which had to be added to the area. We didn't know what they ate, so we had to add all these different plants into it. Now, what we didn't think of when we were doing this design was the area around it to protect it. So we designed that we would use a specific type of hedge to hide this area and stop the general public from being able to cross into that area and disturb the habitat of this creature. Now, the problem we've had with that maintenance is that we added a hedge which also spreads. So it's slowly been trying to creep in, and we're having to maintain that constantly and pull it back to make sure that it's not affecting these beetles, which are extremely rare. As we say, we thought they were extinct in the UK. So every aspect has to be thought of. You can't just think of, I'm going to take this section and put it there. You've got to think of how that's going to then adapt and survive in the future because of how that area is maintained.
Yes, and these are important considerations. Thank you for providing this example. These are the kinds of questions and dilemmas that future architects, designers are going to have to deal with in order to implement these visions. But I do think the visions are still very important to guide people toward at least having an understanding of what the world could look like. And then as they tackle the day-to-day problems, they still have that vision. And science fiction ideally also should provide us with that kind of vision. Star Trek, for instance, has inspired a lot of the technology and the interfaces that we use. The mobile phones and the tablets are prime examples. Even though we don't live in a Star Trek society right now, we have been able to achieve some aspects of that vision just because that vision was out there, just because it inspired a lot of people. So this is an interesting question from Mike Lazine. Where would we build these cities in the USA? There would be a lot of people who would want to make it hard to do, especially politicians. And yes, in the United States, it's very difficult to build in certain parts of the country, particularly in large cities with a lot of activist groups or wealthy homeowners who don't want development around them. And you have opposition from both the right and the left. So on the right, you have wealthy homeowners who say, oh, we don't want multifamily housing near us. We don't want those riffraff living where we live, which is a really condescending attitude in my view, but it limits a lot of development. And on the left, you have a lot of these so-called community activist groups saying, oh, no, you can't build this new apartment complex here. You can't renovate this building because that changes the historic character of our neighborhood. We're afraid of gentrification. We're afraid of quote, being priced out of these kinds of developments. But the end result is people in these communities who are primarily minorities, they live in terrible housing conditions as a result. They live in buildings that could be 100 years old or more and are dilapidated. And they don't see a way out. And when someone tries to offer them a way out, some of these community activist groups bring people out in droves to oppose even the most modest development. So I wonder if you, Thomas, or anyone on this panel has ideas about how those log jams could be broken, or whether there are just places where these kinds of visions could be implemented from scratch in the United States and where there wouldn't be these special interests resisting them initially.
So I personally live in what's called a prefab house. My housing was built just after the war, and it was build it quickly and as quickly as possible so that we can get people in. So it's basically just solid concrete. It's not the nicest to look at. They're not designed to be nice to look at, but they're built quickly because after the war, we had so many people who were homeless after the bombing raids, things like that, that they just chucked them up. We have a thing called the Green Belt here, which the Green Belt is a ring of area where you cannot build in the UK, and it's all the way around London, and that belt is basically the lungs of London. Now, there are people who are pushing to try and build within those areas. And it goes back to where I was saying before. I believe that you can build on these areas, but you have to protect the wildlife and the nature and things like that that is there at the same time. And to do that, you have to adapt the building processes, not just the building itself, not just the area itself. So you've got to look into how you adapt those buildings. So part of the green belt that is closest to me is mainly oak forests, and those oak forests, obviously the tree roots go quite deep. They're ancient trees. You can't really knock them down because they are what we have called a TPO on them, which is a tree protection order. So how do you adapt to that? You build around them. You build and incorporate those into the design themselves. There are plenty of areas of America which are desert, for instance, like Arizona, where yourself is. Now, when you have building work going on there, I'm guessing you have a lot of problems with sand blowing over the roads and burying the roads, or you have the problem of there not being a stable enough base for that building to stand properly. But you have those areas which you can adapt, and you just need to adapt the building method to the area that you're building on. Obviously, you're talking about going into natural parks and things like that then, which is where your problems may lie. So you've got to design the building around that environment.
So David here is in Arizona. I'm actually in Nevada. We have some similarities in climate, but some differences as well. I would say there are parts of Arizona and southern Nevada which are more of the kind of true desert where you could have sand blowing, as you described. Northern Nevada is more high desert, so more of this mountain climate, a bit more temperate, dry, very dry, and a lot of different soils. So we do have areas where there are compact soils or even rocks. Of course, a lot of variety in terrain. Mostly the construction has been in valleys where it's a little bit flatter, but there's plenty of room in Nevada. And about 85% of the land in Nevada is federally owned. Now there are some landscapes there or interesting structures that should be preserved, but a lot of it is just barren scrubland that people haven't developed because they're not allowed to develop it. But David, I think you would be better suited to comment on Arizona and the situation there, and if you can foresee opportunities for development, including in places where there's currently no habitation.
Yeah, I don't have specific experience when it comes to, soils and things of that nature for how suitable land would be for structures. One thing that does jump out at me, though, is here in the American West, whether it be Nevada or where I used to live in southern Nevada for about a decade before I moved here to the Phoenix area. And there are, whether it's southern Nevada or the central area of Phoenix where I am at, and parts a little further to the south, there is lots of wide open spaces. And I think that the reason for the wide open spaces, well, they would vary, of course, but infrastructure, we essentially have one freeway that connects Tucson and Phoenix, for example, and then the roads outside of that are much more modest. Things like being able, water is a big issue in the desert. Behind me, the picture is Lake Pleasant, which is a recreational area and reservoir for the Phoenix area. So those would all be limiting factors. Yes, there's lots and lots of land, perhaps lots of places to put solar panels, as long as you can build that infrastructure to tie it into the grid system. But as far as the rest of the infrastructure, roadways, being able to take water and other utilities into those areas, those might be pretty challenging. Perhaps some of the things that we look forward to, or at least I do, in a transhumanist future have to do with more decentralization, where I can find ways to bring my own water and power and other things that I need into those areas. And those areas can be developed, but not developed like the way maybe residential and commercial areas were in the latter 20th century. When I lived in Nevada, I lived in a very large, at that time, I think it was the largest pre-planned community, and that was in southern Nevada. So I really like the order. I like the roadways were thought out in advance. Power and utility runs were thought out in advance. The way residential and commercial and industrial areas were laid out were all thought out in advance, instead of more of the ad hoc way that cities and societies have been done in the past. as I look forward to the transhumanist future and decentralization, I wonder what we'll see. I wonder if we'll be able to see some type of high order that allows individuality and decentralization at the lower levels, or how that will work. So I don't know, and I don't know how that will work out in Arizona, but I'm very keen to find out. Art, do you have anything to add from the Tucson area?
Yeah, I think what you need is this arcology concept at the residential level. Because yeah, the problem is going to be that infrastructure. Like, how do you get electricity to you? How do you get sewer? How do you get water? You know, so if you can create that arcology principle at a residential level where it has its own solar panels, its own sewage treatment, some ability of water harvesting or getting it from the atmosphere, you'll have a better chance of building out in a remote area, because yeah, there's plenty of land out there, but you need access to resources, and yeah, that's what I see around here. I mean, I can drive out a few miles going west, and there's just a whole lot of nothing. So yeah, the space is there, the utilities and infrastructure is not.
Yes, indeed. And we have in the comments John H. writing that dearth of fresh water is a likely problem in those areas, as both Artemon and David have confirmed. And then he says lots of wide open spaces going north from the environs of Arizona and Nevada. Wyoming and Montana are virtually empty compared to, say, California or pretty much anywhere in the east. And that's correct as well. One could drive for 100 miles or more before encountering a settlement in some of these areas. And then he mentions, to say nothing of continuing north into Alberta, the Yukon Territories, and British Columbia in Canada. So there is plenty of room to spread out if the infrastructure challenges are resolved. On the other hand, we also have some very densely populated cities in the United States, places like Chicago. And of course, Charlie has resided in Chicago and knows a lot about it. It's one of the most architecturally interesting cities on the North American continent. And it's had a bit of a boom over the past decade, I would say, especially compared to what the downtown area was like when I visited it in the early 2000s and when I visited it in 2018 through early 2020. There has been a lot of new construction there. So I think we might have lost Charlie for a moment, but when he returns, we might ask him about that. In the meantime, Pavel has a comment saying, can we build self-sustained arcologies as a separate transhumanist jurisdiction? We need our hip-hop city, and that's a reference to Maitreya 1 seeking a transhumanist city-state, also based on transhumanist hip-hop. I think it would be a great idea. Of course, the Transhumanist Party supports jurisdictional experimentation with micronations, for example. And yes, if we could have a self-contained city-state like that, that would be quite promising as a hub of innovation. Now, let's continue with some of the audience comments. So John Halloran states we might have, quote, mutating cities which change their configurations over time. And he also notes we're talking as if the singularity will not have happened in the next 50 to 100 years. Beyond that point, we simply have no idea. So I think he's speaking to the idea that it's very difficult to anticipate exactly what paths future technologies would take or how that would affect the appearance of everyday life. And everything we're doing now is kind of a set of speculative visions, in the sense that we're seeing some of the trends that are emerging. We're trying to think about where they could lead if they continued, if they interacted with one another in certain ways. And yet we are also fallible humans who live in our present day society. And so what we're able to conceive of is necessarily limited by that, in the sense that we're starting out with certain mindsets, certain assumptions, certain knowledge, and people in the future are going to have different knowledge necessarily. So I think these are worthwhile exercises in the sense that, once again, we're thinking about this and we're developing the visions, and these visions then are going to inform and motivate what people do in their paths toward a future. I think this is one of the key aspects that distinguish the environment of progress in the contemporary world from, say, the ancient world. Where in the ancient world, there were some tinkerers here and there. There were little steam toys being developed in Alexandria in even the 1st century BCE. But most of the intellectuals, most of the artists, most of the scholars weren't focused on that. They were either focused on very abstract philosophy or on religion or on just day-to-day matters, practical household or city management. Some of them might have treatises on government, but they all pretty much assumed that the general state of the world would be very similar to what it was at that time. So there wasn't this idea in Rome, for instance, let's go ahead and have an industrial revolution. Let's automate labor instead of having all of these slaves. And of course, the economy they built, it worked for a while they had conquests, while they had slaves that they could import from other populations. But because they didn't have significant technological progress, they built a bunch of infrastructure, but they ultimately couldn't maintain it because of the internal strife, and the Roman Empire fell apart. So having a vision of consistent, sustainable progress is extremely important. So then let's move
Going on, carrying
Yes.
on with that point, sorry.
Certainly.
So when we're talking about looking at the future, we do also have to focus on the bad parts as well, because obviously those are what we're trying to evolve against, to try and adapt against with these buildings. So you look at the environmental factors. Where is the environment going to be in the future? Overpopulation, for instance. There's always we can design this into our building materials and building structures and the world around us, so that we adapt that, so that those aren't problems anymore. So one concept that I actually looked into before was actually how much land there is per person in the world. I know this is going to sound very communist, and I know Americans aren't the best with that kind of, that ideology. But if you look at per person how much land mass there is, it is something like 60 kilometers round. It's a very small area. Now, when you think about food produce that people consume, with overpopulation, that area is getting smaller, and there's less likely to be able to produce enough food or enough energy or enough of anything in those things. So one of the ways we looked at it before is making cities, make it into a small area where you can produce the food outside, but you're not losing the problem at all. You're not designing the problem out of it. So we've got to look into these kind of concepts when designing buildings in the future. If you look at India, for instance, when British colonies went to India to basically take over, they looked at what they had as their water systems, and they had almost like large inverted pyramids where they got their water from. They bathed, and British went there and went, oh, look how uncivilized this is, look how undignified this is, and we built canals. What we didn't realize was we were then spreading malaria through the canals. So there are all different aspects of building that when you do one thing, there is causality. You're going to end up changing the way the things around it adapt and work. So you need to take into consideration these things and counter that with those designs.
Yes, indeed. So there could be unintended consequences or interactions with the environment that need to be taken into account. And certainly infectious disease is one such consideration, especially since we are in the middle of a global pandemic. It is worthwhile to think how our infrastructure could contribute to the spread of infectious disease or arrest the spread of infectious disease. So one of the thoughts that I have had is, due to the cultural shift that has happened very rapidly to remote work for a large number of professionals, it's no longer necessary for a lot of knowledge workers to reside near their place of work. And one of the reasons why city centers have been so populated and so expensive to reside in, despite less than optimal conditions, has been this effect of people crowding near where they wanted to work, and large companies would set up their headquarters in city centers, and they would want all their workers to be nearby because there's this older school of management that believes that you need to have people in physical proximity, interacting with one another all the time. And then when COVID-19 happened, most of those entities had no choice but to try to continue operations somehow by essentially telling people to work from home. And as people are working from home, a lot of them are finding that this is just as good, if not better, in terms of productivity. And there are tools like Zoom or other remote video conferencing software that enable the human interaction to take place. And of course, if you have a work environment where everything is digitized, you can continue to produce with the same effectiveness. So it may no longer be necessary for knowledge workers to live in city centers. And if people decide to instead prioritize affordability of housing or personal comfort, they might choose to spread out. So we could have a revival of suburbs or exurbs, or even people deciding to go into the countryside and have a really large home, an estate of some sort, where they could just telecommute from and do their jobs. So I wonder if that's going to change the future architectures and designs, where we might see less dense but more widespread human habitation taking form in the coming decades. What do you think about this, Thomas?
I would hope so, personally. I would hope so, that we do spread out a lot more. You're already seeing it in London, for instance. There's a lot more of the population moving outwards. But this has, again, its own consequences. So now you have environmental problems of people swimming in rivers, which had people swimming in them before, but now they've got a much larger population of people swimming within them, causing problems for the fish and wildlife that live there. So there is a cause and causality thing, which we've got to think about with all of these concepts and all of these little things. I personally would hope that we do move out more and spread across more equally, just so that we can make it a bit more sustainable for each and every individual person.
Yes, indeed. And now we have Charlie back. So we were discussing differences between city living and more spread out living. And of course, you've been in the city of Chicago, and I mentioned how the city of Chicago has been transformed over the past several decades. There was a building boom there prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what do you see as possible future trajectories for the development of cities like that, cities that have attracted a lot of economic growth, but may be severely challenged now that we are in the midst of a pandemic, and let's say there are more incentives for people to spread out to a greater extent.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen. I think that's happening even if there wasn't a pandemic, because we are going to move to more of a teleological society where we're going to be, it's more of a telepresence and people are going to start interacting. I think the COVID just expedited that. And you're going to see there's no need to live as close as necessary to your work. That's just happened, that's happened quite a bit with COVID, and it's going to happen even more so as automation takes on more and more of the jobs that we see that people don't have to tend to. There's another development because of technology, which is 3D printing. Now, 3D printing, we are mostly familiar with it with the smaller versions that we do in households and such, but they do have now large scale 3D printings that print homes. There's a company called Icon that is paired up with a company, a charity called New Story. And what they're doing is they're developing these, they're about 800 square feet approximately, 3D printed homes that they can do in about 24 hours. They cost about $4,000, and they're doing it for underserved or distressed communities, for people that are otherwise might be homeless. And so that that kind of bringing that cost down for people, you're going to see that happen a lot. There's other companies that are using biograde materials, to recycle it for the use of rebuilding 3D printed homes. The 3D printed home market is booming. It's actually all around the world. There's a neighborhood in the Netherlands called Eindhoven, and they have something called the Project Milestone, and they're also doing the same kind of thing where they're going to build a whole neighborhood of inexpensive 3D printed homes. And I think there was one in there's one that got in the newspaper not long ago about I say newspaper, what's that? Not long ago in France. It's about over 1,000 square feet. It's got 4 bedrooms. There's people going to move in soon. And there's multi-story homes being 3D printed in Asia. So that's the kind of thing that's going to transform how we live too, because the cost is going to come way down. And plus you can start building these everywhere. So that, I mean, how the world's going to look and how cities are going to look, man, it's hard to really, unless you bring in all the different aspects of change and really put them together in your head, or better yet, use a AI, then you'll really probably get a much better idea of what we're going to look like, whether it's even going to be cities or what we're going to call them.
Yes, indeed. So, Thomas, what are your thoughts on 3D printing technology and how that could transform the cities of the future?
So I love 3D technology. I think the fact that we now have multi-material 3D printers, where they include things like medical grade rubber, metals, things like that, it's fantastic of what we can actually perceive and do. Currently, a lot of the actual structures themselves are very basic. So they've not got a specific element to them that you can get with a human doing the project itself. So it may go up quicker, but it doesn't have that, what's the way of putting it, that exact precision that you can get with a human eye. So if you look at brickwork, for instance, they actually did race a brick-laying robot and a brick-laying human. And by far, the human out-bricked him. I don't know if that's even a saying, but yeah, they've managed to put the bricks down a lot quicker. You do get robots which lay paths, but as soon as something goes wrong, that whole thing's buggered up and you need to reset. So that it's the human element kind of is needed in construction, but these tools are definitely helping with production. So there's also another company in Holland which is producing So you know when you get packaging and it comes in that plastic formwork, which is not environmentally friendly. There's one company which is growing that from mushrooms now, and using that. Literally, they can grow it into the shape of the product itself. Now, I personally would like to see that kind of technology coming into building work, where we can literally grow buildings rather than actually, constructing them with large pieces of machinery. But as I say, being in the building industry and being in construction, I have seen these technologies, and I do think they're quite far away from what you would expect them to be. So we do get the 3D printers which can build up houses in a certain amount of time, but they're not always multifunctional. It's not got a certain element to the designs yet, and it is very limited at the moment.
Interesting. And indeed, some of our viewers had mentioned the mushroom bricks in the comments in the chat, as well as a potential future technology. But it seems the challenge now is that any automated production technique, just like any automated system, it can be at present very skilled at a narrow, well-defined set of tasks, but humans are still more versatile in the sense that humans can adapt to changing conditions or correct more easily if there's some sort of mistake or some sort of suboptimal circumstance. This is the problem right now that is in large part delaying the adoption of autonomous vehicles, where they can actually be safer than manually driven cars in 99+% of circumstances, but it's those extreme and unusual events, like what if there's a blizzard on the roads, or what if there's a white truck that kind of looks like the glare of the sun, where they're not yet fully capable of determining the optimal path forward, whereas a human can kind of muddle through or adjust or make course corrections. So with narrow AI or just machines that are pre-programmed to exercise certain tasks, it's very difficult for them to have that nuance, that sort of responsiveness. But nonetheless, those are promising technologies if they coexist with human direction or human ability to correct for their mistakes. And I think that also speaks to a kind of hybrid economic model in the future, where jobs aren't going to be obsolete per se, but they're going to be different, and they will involve humans collaborating with AI and robots and these kinds of heavy industrial machinery that can engage in 3D printing or manufacturing of different kinds of materials. So what do you think about that, Thomas, as a potential future vision?
Yeah, so there's so many different aspects of building work that needs to be adapted. So, for instance, if you're looking at a mini digger or something like that, if that hits a cable underground, then you do still have a driver within that who is going to suffer injury. Or if you have, for instance, a lawnmower and it's malfunctioning, doesn't switch off properly, and the guy's trying to clean it out, he can end up cutting off his hand. Now, you've still got to maintain those tools, but you've got to have that adaptivity where it can still be manually used. It's a good idea to have these because you're minimizing risk to the workers themselves who are actually out there putting their life on the line to do these building works. But there has to be someone there making sure it's doing what it should do, because otherwise, if that machine falls over and it's still carrying on the same program, what's it actually then building? It's building a problem. It's yeah.
Yes, indeed. So are there any other thoughts from the panel about the interaction of humans and machines and AI to help build some of these cities and communities of the future? Let's see. Then we can proceed to some of the other comments. Now, there were some comments recently in the chat about how criminal activity and the prevalence of criminal activity may be affected by the change in modes of habitation. So if we have the kind of future city that was portrayed in the art concept that was shown, or if people spread out a bit more going forward, uh, and of course, society is going to evolve along with that. And hopefully, with technology, people are going to lead overall better, more fulfilled lives. They would have less incentive to engage in criminal activity. There has been, over the course of the long arc of history, a significant decline in criminal activity, as Steven Pinker documented in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. But there have been also periodic spikes, like in the 1960s in much of the Western world, or in the recent years in certain inner city areas, like going back to Chicago. Chicago is going through a major crime wave right
2 days
now.
ago.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is an open question to everyone on the panel. What do you think the long-term trend is going to be with regard to criminal activity, and what sorts of technological changes are going to be most effective in hopefully reducing crime, no matter what sort of cities or other communities we end up living in?
Well, I can address a little bit. There was looting in Chicago not long ago. You know, it's really unfortunate, and the people that are doing the looting tend to be the people that are poverty stricken. And but when and you know and it happened along Magnificent Mile, which is a kind of a famous street in Chicago, where all the fancy stores are located. And the looters came, you know, in the dark of night, and they would smash all the windows. There would be hundreds of them show up, and they'd smash the windows and steal. They'd steal things. You know, they'd steal, you know, expensive shoes, Nike shoes, or Gucci purses, things they would steal. But you know, when you think, and this is not, I mean, this is brought upon the inequality that we see, you know, through economics, and so there's an overall frustration that there's very, very wealthy, and there's very poor, and eventually, if we don't address that, then these kind of things could happen more often. But when you think about things that are being stolen, those are the same kind of things that we could talk about 3D printing. I mean, you could literally 3D print a lot of things, and in the future that will be the case. And if everybody is given a 3D printer or a molecular manufacturing device of some sort in their household, well, gee, they could kind of print up all those things. That would be a supplement to a universal basic income that people claim it's not affordable. But you know, if you think that universal basic income is not affordable, what do you do then? I mean, do you not do something for these people that are going to, you know, be upset and want to loot because there's the economic inequality? So things like 3D printing really could be the kind of thing that would help offset whatever that cost may be. Not to mention other things that are going to come about in the future with technology. But you know, that is an issue in our city, where there's these looters, and some businesses have gone out of business because they can't come back from the damage that occurred, and on top of it with the COVID. So there has to be a restructure of how things are going to be brought to people, and how people are going to deal with it, and then and the income. I mean, these are all tied together. It's really hard to say, what are you going to do about housing, and then not talk about the economic inequalities and the distribution of wealth. So it's a tough thing, but I do see a path where technology is going to address all these issues and eventually solve them. It's that hard road that we're going through right now that's unfortunate, especially for a lot of the people that are economically challenged.
Yes,
So
indeed.
sorry, I just
yes.
want to adapt on that point. So you were saying about 3D printers being able to help in that sort of area. But just because someone gets a 3D printer doesn't mean that they can then afford the materials that are needed to produce those products. The main way I personally see us being able to adapt to future crime and things like that is actually a rejigging of the educational system to help people get educated into surviving around automation, because that's our main problem, is that automation is causing people to lose jobs across the board. And with the continuing of AI and things like that, it's going to be widespread to a point where we need to be educated in that way. We need to adapt the whole educational system for the future, not just for the now. Because at the moment we're continuing the educational system across the board in any country that you go to is over 100 and something years old. It's focusing on technologies and information that was from that section, and we need to try and push it forward.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on the education aspect. We are behind on that, and I do think that's another aspect of technology that will cause the education. I mean, that system will change. I mean, there's no question that we're gonna start to refine and better the ways of education through, learning online. That's just inevitable. That's going to happen. It's just because of the convenience. Consider the travel time that needs to happen for people to get to places to learn, or some of the crime that was happening in some of those fraternity houses and such, or all sorts of things that can be eliminated. And I do think that, while you can have a better education, as you said, automation is going to wipe out jobs. So, we do need to be smarter, but we're going to have to adapt to the fact that there just won't be enough jobs for everybody. And in that case, universal basic income has to be figured out. So, and I was just suggesting the idea of 3D printing, which eventually will get better because we are growing exponentially on all our technologies, as a way to supplement the UBI. And that's also going to apply. I mean, if we're going to get into it, that's also going to have to apply to our medical world, because we can't have, like in the United States, where someone gets falls down the stairs and they go to the hospital for a week, they have to file bankruptcy. We can't have where there's no medical services for people that are poor. I mean,
well, we don't have that problem over here in the UK, but it's but I completely agree. 3D printing is part of that solution. Again, it has to be involved with some form of UBI, and some reform of the educational system. I'm a big fan of 3D printers, and I'm a big fan of the meme which said, what was it? 3D printers, the awkward moment where capitalism gave us the means of production.
I like that.
So it's one of those ones where it's got to be adapted to work the best way, and just by going, have a 3D printer in every garage or whatever it was, it's a great idea, but without that worked around it so that people have the raw materials, it's one of the reasons why I am very adamant that in the future we need to be able to share out these materials, and then you can decide from what materials you have in your home, I will take this amount of plastic from this and build something else out of it, and being able to reuse the materials that you have.
Yes, indeed.
There was if that, you're right about that, but like there was, as Eric Drexler wrote in his book in in the 80s. You know, molecular manufacturing devices was something he talked about, which would be beyond 3D printers, and that's something that's actually been talked about, and people are starting to work on prototypes, because eventually you'll be able to just use anything. I mean, when you think about it, theoretically, everything's made of molecules and atoms. So in theory, we should be able to take anything apart and rebuild it into anything else. And that's kind of what his vision was. So yeah, I look forward to this kind of stuff. And I do see us as I see this kind of happening sooner than a lot of people think that it will happen, because, you know, we tend to look linearly at the trajectories rather than the exponential trajectory that we're actually on. So yeah, I think we're in agreement on this. It's exciting
I
how
do.
this is all going to play out.
Yeah, I do think we're in agreement with it. I do think we need to adapt the educational system beforehand, because that way we can at least get more minds working on trying to get these problems solved. I think the educational system is the main thing which needs adapting across the board in every single country across the world, because we're not ready for a singularity world at the moment with the educational system we have.
Well, I think one of the problems with the contemporary educational system, or lack thereof in many cases, is that many people don't realize the long-term consequences of their actions. So those looters that robbed a bunch of businesses and created severe disincentives for those businesses to ever return are going to then deprive their areas of that commerce, of those goods, of set of people willing to supply those goods, because who is going to do that if there's going to be this fear of losing one's livelihood? So in effect, the people who may be looting out of poverty or out of a desire for short-term gain are kind of consigning themselves to poverty going forward by doing that. And if they had a well-rounded education, they would recognize the long-term adverse consequences of doing that. Now, there is a combination of factors that brought this situation about. And I think the lockdowns caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and certain authorities' responses were a contributing factor to driving a lot of people to that kind of desperation. But unfortunately, with this kind of action, that magnifies the economic strain on people, including many people who didn't engage in the looting, who happen to live in those communities, but now can't patronize those businesses anymore. So it's a vicious cycle. And what we need to do is, through technology, education, moral reasoning, any of the tools available to us, is transform this vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. So all of these influences, from better educational systems, remote learning, to 3D printing and automation and sustainable superabundance, are going to lower the incentives for people to loot, are going to increase the incentives for people to contribute productively to the development of the human species. That is what my hope would be. And I agree, there's no one magic bullet, there's no single solution, but each of them could contribute a little bit, and in totality, they could contribute a lot to reversing this vicious downward spiral that we've been seeing over the past few months. So what are everyone's thoughts on that?
So one of the things actually we spoke about before we actually started this video call was how people's attention spans are slowly starting to start moving away to the more consumerism sort of ideals. So you've got the whole fact of people want the information there, then and now, because that is how we now learn since the invention of the internet. Things have slowly been progressing where we have our burgers coming faster to us. We can now just order food off Deliveroo, and we get annoyed when it comes in a little bit too late. So it's about looking at the mental health of these aspects as well, because we're doing a live stream at the moment, but people want that there, then and now, where they're getting that information to them as soon as possible through this conversation. But there is that mental health aspect of it where you get bored of things quite often, quite easily, and you begin to get depressed when you don't get it as fast as you do. So I think we have to add that into the educational system of looking after your own mental health, having that off-screen time, just so that we can adapt to that sort of viewpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's an important point. We've had a lot of rapid innovation in media and how people consume information, but at the same time, human habits are much slower to evolve. And some of the ways in which people have adapted to the new media have been less than ideal if one considers some of the behavior that goes on social media, for example, or how some of the let's say, expectations of instantaneous response have developed in the sense that now a lot of people are spending their time being purely reactive to very new kinds of interactions or developments instead of more strategically planning out their interactions. And I'm a bit old-fashioned in this sense, in that I personally like to pre-schedule my calls. These would be largely video calls these days, but I used to do that in the days of telephone conference calls, where I would pre-schedule certain interactions weeks in advance, sometimes days in advance, but if I could do it weeks in advance, I would, and then I would prepare for the calls. I would study the relevant information to ensure the best possible outcome. And likewise, prior to the age of social media, it was pretty routine to have emails responded to, say, about a week after they were sent. And people didn't think that that was a big deal. It was considered fairly standard, especially because the prior analog to that was paper mail, and paper mail would take a few days to get to the recipients. So people had the expectations of that built-in gap, and that gave people the time to think about what they were saying also, and be perhaps a bit more deliberative and a little less hasty. Now, of course, there is this kind of felt pressure to respond right away, especially in settings where large numbers of people may participate. So if someone makes a comment or poses a question and perhaps there's a misinterpretation embedded in that, the temptation is to respond right away to especially correct what may be an error, because if you don't correct that error, other people might jump on it and magnify it until the situation gets out of control, which you didn't have with one-on-one correspondence prior to the days of social media. So I wonder how it might be possible to get to a world where people's interactions become a bit more structured again, with built-in buffers for thinking about what one is going to say before one says it, and also this reciprocal recognition that good insights may take time to generate. They may take some thought to generate. You're not always just going to be swimming in this sea of reactivity to every comment that gets made. What are your thoughts on that? Anyone willing to put forth some ideas?
So I'll put forward. I personally think we need to add mental health to any educational system, just because, for one, myself, I had my whole thing where I suffered from psychosis. I use artwork to portray myself, so hence the two things behind me. It's art therapy, which I use to sort of portray and get control back over myself. And that's worked for me. But what you do find is that people don't look after not only their own mental health, but the mental health of other people. And when you've got social media and things like that, you've constantly got this stream of information. Some people aren't reacting. You don't have a human face in front of you all the time. With social media, you just have written text. So it could be, you just sprawl out all of your mental anguish, and you're affecting someone else's mental health in the process. So looking after mental health should be added to all aspects of social media, to all educational systems. And that is by far one of the most important things, I think, for us to get to any future where we work together and we are doing a good thing together.
Yes, indeed. And I appreciate you bringing attention to this important area. Certainly, it's worth thinking about how these kinds of interactions could affect mental health and how to structure them in a way that's beneficial to people's mental health. And you mentioned art. Of course, art is one of the central subjects of this conversation. I think the ability for art to convey messages very concisely, like the scene that you showed with the wide variety of future technologies and their impacts upon the world. That's a way to perhaps overcome this limited attention span that a lot of people have. And they could see the essential messages of that artwork right away, one would hope, or they would be tempted to explore it further and derive additional meaning from it. Sometimes I think great art is art that makes one pause and want to look further and want to zoom in, so to speak. With digital art, of course, that is now a possibility. If you were in a museum, especially before the era of mobile phones, so you couldn't photograph a painting or zoom in on it, your time interacting with it would be spent just standing in front of it. And then if you had a discerning eye, you could catch some details and focus on those. But a lot of the great art of the past has been digitized now. So you could look at an image that is in extremely high resolution. A lot of these images are free and in the public domain. And you could notice certain details there that you wouldn't have been able to notice even looking at it in person in a museum. And I think the best art is the art that makes you want to do that, that makes you want to take a break from whatever stream of information you've been swimming in and really engage with that artwork and see what it can show you, perhaps what thoughts it can provoke. And I think that's a great help for mental health of some people as well, because especially if the art is uplifting, if it's hopeful, if it shows a pleasant possibility for the future, or even if it's just more generally a pleasant scene, a nice landscape, then that's time well spent. That's time that someone can enjoy. That's time spent in a good space within the world for a person.
See, I don't believe art has to be always happy and sunny and things like that. You look at MC Escher's work where he's got the melting clocks and things like that. There doesn't have to be that pleasantness to it, as long as it's portraying an emotion and it's getting something across, then it can have that effect. But whilst we're on the subject of digitization of artwork, and while we also have crime fresh in our minds and riots and looting, let's talk about the statues that got destroyed during the current riots and race relations. So you had the Black Lives Matter movement over there and a statue toppled over here. That's part of the whole special relationship between the American and UK sort of bodies, is that we do react off of each other's own politics. And one thing I noticed is when our statue went down, there was the talk of having it go back up, should it go back up, things like this. And my main idea to that aspect was digitalizing the statues so they had somewhere to go. We can literally 3D scan them and have them in a digital place where anyone around the world can go and see. And the raw materials of those statues can be used for other things. I think that statue itself that toppled was made of brass, which can be used for plumbing. It can be used for musical instruments. There are all different aspects that statue could have been used for, raw material wise, which is rare across the earth now as we grow as a population. So there are ways that we can use that to adapt to our future.
That's interesting. Now, I do agree with you on preserving the image of the statue. I think, though, more generally, it was a mistake to destroy any work of art, because one has to look at it in a broader historical context, what it can teach us about the past, what it can teach us about how people thought, how people lived, even how people created art and for what purposes. So the materials out of which this statue was made, they're an indication of the technological state of advancement of people at the time. And of course, we have a lot of examples of art from past civilizations which were brutal. Say the Assyrians, for example, or we have busts of various Roman emperors who were completely cruel and degenerate people like Caligula or Domitian or Elagabalus, who were terrible human beings and extremely oppressive. I don't think anybody considers them to be virtuous, and yet the representations of these people have been preserved because they tell us something about what happened during that time period in a society that was very different from ours, and of course had its own struggles and injustices. And the reason why those artworks were spared, even though there is now a humorous hashtag going around on Twitter, something to the effect of canceling Genghis Khan because he was clearly a bloodthirsty tyrant and conqueror whose ethics nobody would agree with today. But I think there's this recognition that, okay, for these past societies which are no longer affecting the world today, we should keep the art, we should learn from it. The only difference is there are certain current tensions that have some parallels in history. So if somebody was a slave trader or a supporter of slavery in the past, some people question, well, why is there a statue to that person? And I understand that. But perhaps the better approach would be to relocate the statues to, say, museum exhibits, which could then have the proper contextual framing. Like, this is a museum exhibit about the history of slavery or the slave trade or advocacy of slavery. And there could also be commentary about how this was an oppressive system, how while some people might have glorified it in the past, we know better now. And also, this could be juxtaposed with more critical artworks or the history of the abolitionist movement and how that movement challenged the institution of slavery. So I think that would be a more nuanced way of interacting with this art, which doesn't condone the historical evils of those kinds of individuals or those kinds of movements, but at the same time recognizes that this happened and we need to confront it. We don't have to see it in a public park or in front of a building, but those who wish to understand what happened and why, should be allowed to do that. So, yes,
do
go
you
ahead.
feel there should be a limit on how many statues are built of in particular person? Because, for instance, I can think of 3 individual statues of Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill was a great person. He was in British history. You can't deny he helps us win the war. But he did also have racial problems with certain people, certain type of people. Now, there are 3 statues I can think of individually of that same person. Do we need all 3 of them to actually be in presence? Or can those statues then be digitalized so that there is that force somewhere for people to learn about it, to see that statue, to see that artwork, but there is still one physical representation of them as well?
Well, I think it really depends on what people come into contact with. So, of course, not everyone is going to be in the same public space at the same time, or perhaps ever. Some people will live in one city and spend the predominant share of their time there. Others will live in another. Of course, in the age of the internet, yes, you could see a picture of a Winston Churchill statue, or even have some sort of a virtual experience of that. You could even have a virtual world with statues that have no parallel in the physical world. And of course, I'm in favor of all of those kinds of experiments. But I think in terms of what has been created already, that's a representation of a period in history, and the kinds of circumstances, the kinds of thoughts, the kinds of values that prevailed there. So, as a person who very much favors historic preservation, but also favors building new chapters of our history, my preference would be with those statues to either relocate them or to surround them with more contemporary art and commentary. And I agree, there have been some seriously problematic attitudes and behaviors that Winston Churchill displayed. You could read some of his comments about populations in other parts of the world, for example. But wouldn't it be more powerful to keep the Winston Churchill statue and then build another statue of a person who really defied the stereotypes that Winston Churchill exhibited, or some sort of even mural that critiques Winston Churchill? And that way people will have access to all of that, and they will really learn about that period of history. They will learn in a nuanced way, both the good parts and the unfortunate parts of that history. So Alexandria Black also made a comment just now: put the statues in museums and give the history showing what was wrong. And yes, I think that is one of the better approaches that could be employed. She also said music is a quicker, more visceral form of art. I suppose it engages different senses. It could be complementary even to visual art. Sometimes, of course, music sets up certain moods, certain emotions, and those can be combined with visual scenes. And I myself listen to quite a bit of classical music, about 10 hours or more per day, in fact, as I engage in other endeavors. So that's definitely another way of reaching the human mind. Of course, music by itself, it's a bit more abstract. You can have incidental music to accompany a particular story or scenery, but there's a general emotional language to music, which is, let's say, more basic. There's a great thinker along these lines, M. Zachary Johnson, and he has a book on music and emotion, emotion in life and music, which I would recommend. I'm going to post a link to it in the chat, which discusses how music can evoke certain emotions even independently of context. And then the specific context is something that a particular creator could build into it, say with an opera or a musical or a film score. But there's a kind of more general, universal set of emotional evocations that music can bring about. So I think we've had an excellent conversation today about art and transhumanism and future technologies and how those interact, how those can reinforce one another. So I think this is a good time to venture into closing remarks from the U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, and then, as is our custom, we will give our guest the last word in terms of summing up this discussion. So let's start with Art Ramon. What are your thoughts on this conversation?
Back a decade ago, I took a class in multimedia rhetoric, and this was like before social media. So definitely, you can use art as a great rhetorical tool, and it continues to be such. And yeah, thank you for bringing us your project. It was very insightful.
Yes, indeed. And I would echo that we had a fascinating conversation, which was motivated by the art concepts that you showed us. So thank you, Thomas. Now let's go to Charlie. What are your concluding thoughts for this conversation?
Well, yeah, I want to thank Thomas for taking his time and showing us some great artwork. I really like what he put forward. It looks really compelling to just look at it and think about. And I feel a certain kinship. Obviously, you know, I've created a lot of music videos about futuristic technologies, and always trying to put a positive spin on the future in all of them. So I think it's just it's great to be able to see it in a different realm where it's you know, it's artwork, and then the idea of it being digitized artwork where you can, as he was saying, maybe put moving robots into the art itself. I mean, that would just be fascinating to be able to look at. And as Gennady mentioned about music, I would like to see maybe music accompanying the artwork that he creates. So we should probably mention Alma Deutscher, just because we haven't mentioned her in a while. But I want to thank him again. I think it's been a fun session, and I look forward to more like these.
Absolutely. So go find some music of Alma Deutscher and listen to her as you observe various futuristic city concepts or other uplifting visions of the future. I think there's a good match there as well. So thank you for those remarks, Charlie. And now let's go to David Shoemaker.
Yes, hi, and thanks, Thomas, for coming and talking with us today. I agree with the comments about the art, and I want to reiterate how much I really like the broad appeal of the piece that you showed us, showing all the, well, maybe not all, but a very wide area of transhumanists looking at the future for something to connect to. I think that's so important, and I'm glad to see what you're doing and want to follow that. And then that inspires me to say, well, I'm not an artist, but how do I do something along that line? How do I find a way to create a broader appeal for transhumanism, to bring others to it that maybe don't see themselves as transhumanists, but perhaps using your example of that picture, with them looking at that and them seeing themselves in it someplace, realize, well, there is a transhumanist part of me that I want to put forward too. And I think that's one real good way to grow our movement. So bravo for the work that you're doing.
Yes, indeed. I would echo those sentiments as well. And now, Thomas, you have the last word regarding this conversation. How would you like to conclude it?
So I just want to finish it off by saying, so transhumanism is a great joining of human and technology, and it can be shown across the broad in the artwork. One thing I do want to say is that we got to keep the humanist side of transhumanism going. It's probably the most important part of it. So I'm going to let you in on another project which I'm doing. So this here is my usual, that here is my usual food intake. On the 14th of September, I'm taking part in the Rations Challenge, and that is going to be my weekly food intake. So you can tell it's a big difference there. I'm going to be doing that on a website which is called, 2 seconds. That is for Syrian refugees. It's a charity which we're doing, which is www.rationschallenge.org.uk/Thomas-Carroll. You can make a donation there, and just trying to, because art is, if we look at art across the board, it is not just the things we say, it's the things we do, it's the technologies we use. And that's another part of my art, is just trying to keep charity going throughout.
Wonderful. Well, I wish you all the best in that endeavor. Please keep us updated as to how it goes, and feel free to share that link on social media as well, accompanying the posts for this virtual Enlightenment Salon. Hopefully people will check it out. And thank you once again for coming here today. We had an excellent, thought-provoking conversation. Speaking of keeping the humanism in transhumanism, the virtual Enlightenment salons have that as a central motivation, hence the tie to the age of enlightenment. And this conversation very much exemplified that. And this is what we strive to do with all of our virtual Enlightenment salons. So I hope our audience will continue to tune in every Sunday at 1 p.m. US Pacific time, typically. And until then, live long and prosper.